The grand ballroom of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel glowed with 1,000 points of light. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic rainbows across the marble floors, while the city's elite mingled beneath them, draped in couture and dripping with jewels. The annual Children's Future Foundation Gala represented the pinnacle of Los Angeles high society, a place to see and be seen while ostensibly supporting a worthy cause. In one corner of the vast room, three women huddled in conversation, their designer gowns forming a protective circle around their exclusive exchange. Victoria Harrington, Elise Montgomery, and Diane Westfield were fixtures of Beverly Hills society, board members and major donors who considered the gala their personal domain. "Did you see what Margot Heaton is wearing?" Victoria whispered, tilting her champagne flute toward a woman across the room. "Valentino from 3 seasons ago, practically vintage." Elise giggled behind her hand. "Speaking of fashion mistakes, I heard this year they've invited several artists in an attempt to seem relevant, as if actors have any business at a serious philanthropic event." "Well, at least it guarantees press coverage," Diane replied with a sigh, "though God knows what these people actually contribute beyond photo opportunities." Their conversation paused as a woman entered through the main doors. She wore a simple black dress, elegant, but lacking the ostentation that characterized most attendees' attire. Her dark hair was styled in loose waves around her shoulders, and her makeup was understated. She carried herself with quiet confidence as she surveyed the room, seemingly unaware of the impression she made. "Who is that?" Victoria asked, narrowing her eyes. "She looks familiar, but I can't place her." "I think she's one of the entertainment people," Elise replied dismissively. "Probably some television actress." Diane scrutinized the newcomer. "Her dress is certainly accessible. Department store, if I had to guess." The woman in black moved through the crowd, smiling politely but not engaging deeply with anyone. She finally reached the bar, where she ordered a simple sparkling water with lime. Victoria's eyes followed her. "She's on her own. Let's go introduce ourselves. If she's someone, it could be useful. If not, we'll at least satisfy our curiosity." The trio moved across the room like a coordinated unit, practiced in the art of social navigation. They approached the bar, positioning themselves strategically around the woman in the simple black dress. "Hello there," Victoria said, extending a hand draped in diamonds. "I don't believe we've met. Victoria Harrington, board chair. These are my colleagues, Elise Montgomery and Diane Westfield." The woman smiled warmly, taking Victoria's hand. "Hi, I'm Sandra. It's lovely to meet you all. This is my first time at this particular gala, though I've worked with children's charities for years." Victoria's smile remained fixed, but confusion flickered in her eyes. The name alone should have triggered recognition, but something in her brain refused to make the connection. Perhaps it was the lack of entourage, the absence of fanfare, or simply that, without the context of a film premiere or magazine cover, she couldn't place this woman who called herself Sandra. "How wonderful," Victoria replied automatically. "And what exactly do you do, Sandra?" Sandra hesitated for a moment, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I work in the entertainment industry, but my passion is really about connecting people with causes that matter. I believe children's education is one of the most important investments we can make as a society." Elise smiled thinly. "Yes, well, it certainly is trendy these days to have a cause." If the barb landed, Sandra showed no sign of it. "I don't think helping children will ever go out of style," she replied mildly, her smile unchanged. Diane laughed a little too loudly. "Oh, you are sweet. But trust me, dear, charities fall in and out of favor in this town faster than hemlines. Last year it was ocean conservation. This year it's education. Next year, who knows? Urban farming, perhaps." Sandra took a sip of her sparkling water. "I've always found that the most meaningful causes are the ones we commit to for the long haul, regardless of what's fashionable." The trio exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. This woman was either naively earnest or subtly challenging them. Either way, she had become suddenly more interesting. Across the room, another entrance was causing a stir. A tall man with shoulder-length dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard had appeared. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit that somehow managed to look both classic and slightly unconventional. Unlike the woman in the simple black dress, His arrival was immediately noted, with whispers spreading through the crowd like ripples in a pond. "Oh my," Elise breathed, momentarily forgetting her conversation. "Is that who I think it is?" Victoria's posture straightened imperceptibly. "Keanu Reeves. I didn't know he was on the guest list this year." "He's quite the philanthropist, though he keeps it very private," Diane added. "I've heard he's donated millions to children's hospitals over the years." The three women watched as Keanu made his way through the crowd, graciously acknowledging greetings but moving with purpose. He scanned the room as if looking for someone specific. "We should go say hello," Victoria suggested, already plotting their approach. "Absolutely," Elise agreed. "My daughter would never forgive me if I didn't at least try to get a photo." They had nearly forgotten about Sandra until she spoke again. "He really is one of the good ones," she said quietly, a genuine warmth in her voice. Victoria turned back to her with renewed interest. "You know Keanu Reeves?" Sandra smiled. "We've worked together." "Oh," Victoria replied, suddenly reevaluating the woman before her. "You're an actress, then?" "Among other things," Sandra replied simply. Diane laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Well, everyone in this town has been an extra at some point. I was in the background of a commercial once in college. Does that make me an actress, too?" Sandra's expression remained pleasant, but something flickered briefly in her eyes. "I suppose we all have different paths in the industry." Victoria's attention had already drifted back to Keanu, who was now engaged in conversation with the gala's organizer. "Well, it was lovely chatting with you, Sarah." "Sandra," she corrected gently. "Yes, of course. Do enjoy the evening." Victoria gestured to her friends. "Ladies, shall we circulate?" As they began to move away, Sandra called after them. "Actually, I'd love to hear more about your work with the foundation. The promotional materials mentioned some innovative approaches to early education." Victoria paused, caught between her desire to approach Keanu and the social obligation to engage with this increasingly perplexing woman. "Perhaps later," she said, her tone making it clear that later would likely never come. The trio moved away, leaving Sandra alone at the bar once more. If she was bothered by the interaction, she didn't show it, instead turning to speak with an elderly gentleman who had approached to order a drink. As the evening progressed, the ballroom filled to capacity. Waiters circulated with canapés and champagne, while a string quartet played unobtrusively in the corner. The formal program would begin in half an hour, with speeches and a video presentation designed to open checkbooks. Victoria, Elise, and Diane had positioned themselves strategically near where Keanu was engaged in conversation with several board members. They waited for their moment, maintaining a pretense of casual disinterest. "Did you see that Sandra woman talking to Senator Blake?" Elise murmured. "Rather presumptuous, don't you think?" Victoria sniffed. "Some people simply don't understand the protocols of these events. There's a hierarchy, after all." "I Googled her," Diane said, glancing up from her phone. "There's an actress named Sandra Bullock who looks vaguely like her, but surely that can't be her. The real Sandra Bullock would have come with an entourage, dressed in something significant." Victoria glanced across the room to where the woman in the black dress was now chatting animatedly with a group that included several well-known philanthropists. Regardless of who she is, she's certainly making the rounds. One might almost call it networking. "How gauche," Elise replied, using a charity event for professional advancement. Their attention was diverted as Keanu finally disengaged from his conversation and began moving in their general direction. Victoria subtly adjusted her position to intercept him, a practiced smile spreading across her face. "Mr. Reeves," she said warmly, extending her hand. "Victoria Harrington. I'm the board chair for the Children's Future Foundation. We're so honored to have you here tonight." Keanu shook her hand with genuine courtesy. "The honor is mine. The foundation does important work." Elise and Diane quickly introduced themselves, with Elise adding, "My daughter is a huge fan. Would it be terribly imposing to ask for a photo?" Before Keanu could respond, Victoria smoothly intervened. "Perhaps after the program, Elise. I'm sure Mr. Reeves would prefer not to be bombarded with photo requests at a charity event." Keanu smiled politely. "I'd be happy to take a photo later." Victoria placed a proprietary hand on his arm. "Mr. Reeves, I'd love to introduce you to some of our major donors. As you know, children's education faces unprecedented challenges, and your presence here tonight might inspire some significant contributions. Of course, he replied, his gaze drifting over Victoria's shoulder to scan the room. But first, I'm actually looking for... The bar is that way, Diane interrupted helpfully, misinterpreting his search. Or did you need the restroom? It's just past the east entrance. No, thank you. I'm looking for... Victoria interrupted smoothly. Let me guide you to the VIP section. We've reserved tables near the stage for our special guests. As Victoria began to steer him through the crowd, they passed directly by Sandra, who was now standing alone, observing the room. Victoria deliberately accelerated, clearly intending to bypass her without acknowledgement. Keanu, however, stopped abruptly. Sandra, he said, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. Sandra turned, a warm smile spreading across her face. Keanu, I was wondering when you'd show up. To the visible shock of Victoria, Elise, and Diane, Keanu stepped forward and embraced Sandra warmly. Sorry I'm late. Traffic on Wilshire was a nightmare. When isn't it? Sandra replied with a laugh. She glanced at the three women who were now frozen in various states of confusion. I see you've met the board members. Just briefly, Keanu replied. He turned to Victoria. Miss Harrington, have you had a chance to speak with Sandra about her new education initiative? It's quite revolutionary. Victoria's smile had become fixed, a mask that barely concealed her growing discomfort. We chatted briefly earlier, yes. Actually, Elise interjected, a note of uncertainty creeping into her voice. I don't believe we caught your full name earlier, Sandra. Sandra extended her hand. Sandra Bullock, it's a pleasure to meet you, again. The silence that followed was deafening despite the ambient noise of the gala. Victoria's face had gone pale, while Elise's had flushed crimson. Diane seemed frozen in place, her mouth slightly open. Sandra and I have known each other for years, Keanu continued, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the tension. We worked together on Speed in the Lake House, but more importantly, we've partnered on several education initiatives. Sandra's foundation has built incredible programs in New Orleans. I thought you looked familiar, Victoria managed finally, her voice strained. The lighting in here is so challenging. Sandra smiled graciously. It happens all the time. I prefer to keep a low profile at these events. It's about the cause, not the celebrities attending. Elise had recovered enough to attempt damage control. Miss Bullock, we're so honored to have you here tonight. Your work with children's charities is legendary. Sandra nodded in acknowledgement, but didn't elaborate. Instead, she turned to Keanu. Have you seen the presentation they've prepared? There's some footage of the new learning center in East LA that's quite moving. As Sandra and Keanu began discussing the foundation's work, Victoria, Elise, and Diane exchanged panicked glances, silently debating whether to retreat or attempt to salvage the situation. The formal program was about to begin, with guests being ushered to their assigned tables. Victoria, Elise, and Diane had reconvened at their table near the front, speaking in urgent whispers. I can't believe we didn't recognize Sandra Bullock, Elise hissed. She's only one of the most famous actresses in the world. Without the styling team and designer gown, how were we supposed to know? Diane defended. She looked so ordinary. Victoria's lips were pressed into a thin line. The damage is done. We need to focus on damage control now. After the program, we'll approach her, apologize profusely, and invite her to join the advisory board. Do you think she'll mention our interaction to the other board members? Elise asked, anxiety evident in her voice. That depends on whether she's the type to hold grudges, Diane replied. Some of these Hollywood types have egos the size of... She stopped abruptly as the lights dimmed, signaling the start of the program. The foundation's executive director stepped onto the stage, welcoming guests and thanking them for their support. Before we begin our presentation, the director announced, I'd like to acknowledge some special guests who have joined us tonight. Their commitment to children's causes goes far beyond financial contributions. They give their time, their energy, and their platforms to amplify our message. Victoria scanned the room, noting that Sandra and Keanu had been seated at a table with several major donors and the mayor of Los Angeles. First, the director continued, we're honored to have with us an actress whose foundation has built or renovated 16 schools in disaster-affected areas. Her commitment to education has changed thousands of lives. Please welcome Sandra Bullock, who will introduce our program. Applause filled the room as Sandra rose from her table and made her way to the stage. Victoria, Elise, and Diane clapped mechanically, their expressions frozen in polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Sandra took the microphone, her presence on stage transforming her. The simple black dress now seemed elegant rather than plain, her understated appearance a deliberate choice rather than a lack of sophistication. "Thank you for that kind introduction," Sandra began. "But tonight isn't about me or any individual. It's about the collective power we have when we come together for children." As she continued speaking, her passion for the cause became evident. She spoke without notes, clearly knowledgeable about the Foundation's work and the broader issues facing education. She was eloquent, occasionally funny, and deeply sincere. "I'd also like to acknowledge a dear friend who's here tonight," Sandra added toward the end of her introduction. "Someone whose generosity often goes unrecognized because he prefers to give anonymously. His kindness, both on and off screen, has been an inspiration to me for decades. Keanu, thank you for your friendship and your quiet commitment to making the world better." Keanu nodded in acknowledgement as applause broke out again. He seemed almost embarrassed by the attention, reinforcing Sandra's characterization of his private philanthropy. As Sandra concluded her remarks and introduced the video presentation, Victoria leaned toward her companions. "This is worse than I thought. She's not just a celebrity attendee, she's practically a Foundation partner. And we treated her like some unknown actress trying to network," Elise whispered back, horror in her voice. Diane was staring at her phone beneath the table. "According to this, she's donated over $10 million to various education initiatives in the past 5 years alone." Victoria closed her eyes briefly. "We've made a catastrophic error in judgment. The question now is how to contain the damage." The video presentation ended to emotional applause, with many guests discreetly wiping away tears. The executive director returned to the stage to outline specific funding needs and announce that the silent auction would remain open for another hour. As guests began to circulate again, Victoria led her small group on an intercept course towards Sandra, who was engaged in conversation with several donors. "Miss Bullock," Victoria said when there was a brief pause in the conversation, "your introduction was deeply moving. I wonder if we might have a private word." Sandra turned, recognition flickering in her eyes. "Miss Harrington, of course. Though I should mention I'm trying to speak with as many donors as possible before the evening ends." "This will only take a moment," Victoria assured her, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. Sandra excused herself from her current conversation and followed Victoria, with Elise and Diane trailing behind like anxious courtiers. When they reached a relatively private spot, Victoria turned to face her. "Miss Bullock, I feel I must apologize for our earlier interaction. Had we known who you were—" Sandra held up a hand, stopping Victoria mid-sentence. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Victoria blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry?" "The apology you're about to offer is because you now know I'm Sandra Bullock, the actress. But the way you treated me earlier, when you thought I was just Sandra, some unknown person at a charity event, that's what concerns me." Elise stepped forward. "We certainly didn't mean to." "I'm sure you didn't," Sandra interrupted gently. "But intention and impact are different things. When you believed I was a nobody, you dismissed me. You made assumptions about my contributions, my motivations, even my dress." The three women stood in uncomfortable silence, unable to deny the accusation. "I don't share this to make you feel bad," Sandra continued, "but because I think it's important to remember why we're all here tonight. Every person in this room, regardless of their fame or fortune, has something valuable to contribute to this cause. When we create hierarchies and exclusive circles, we limit what we can accomplish together." Victoria had regained her composure. "Your point is well taken, Ms. Bullock, and I assure you, the Foundation values all contributors." "I believe you," Sandra replied, "and I believe in the work you're doing. That's why I'm here." Before the conversation could continue, they were interrupted by Keanu approaching with the executive director. "Sandra," Keanu said, "David wants to discuss the summer reading program. He has some ideas that align with what you're doing in New Orleans. Of course, Sandra replied. She turned back to the three women. If you'll excuse me, perhaps we can continue this conversation at the next board meeting. I've just agreed to join the advisory committee. As Sandra walked away with Keanu and the director, Victoria, Elise, and Diane stood in stunned silence. Advisory committee, Diane finally whispered. She'll be at every quarterly meeting. And she's friends with Keanu Reeves, Elise added, her voice hollow. Victoria watched Sandra's retreating figure, her expression unreadable. We've made a powerful enemy tonight. Or, a voice said from behind them, you've been offered a valuable lesson. They turned to find Keanu standing there, having apparently doubled back after escorting Sandra to her next conversation. Mr. Reeves, Victoria said, startled. I heard your conversation with Sandra, he said quietly. She's too gracious to say it, but I'm not. The way you treated her was unkind, regardless of who you thought she was. The three women stood frozen, caught in the gentle but firm rebuke. Sandra doesn't care about status or recognition, Keanu continued. She cares about children having access to education. That's why she comes to these events without an entourage, why she dresses simply, why she listens more than she speaks. Because for her, it's never been about being Sandra Bullock. It's about being a force for good in whatever way she can. Victoria found her voice. We understand that now, and we deeply regret. The past is done, Keanu interrupted, his tone kind despite his words. What matters is what you choose to do next. Will you approach the next unfamiliar face at a gala with curiosity and respect, or with judgment and dismissal? Without waiting for an answer, he nodded politely and walked away, leaving the three women to contemplate his question. 3 months later, the quarterly board meeting of the Children's Future Foundation was underway in a conference room overlooking downtown Los Angeles. Victoria Harrington was reviewing funding allocations when Sandra Bullock entered, accompanied by a young woman no one recognized. The room immediately tensed, board members watching with interest to see how Victoria would react. The Gala incident had become legendary within Foundation circles, though few knew the full details. To everyone's surprise, Victoria rose immediately and approached Sandra with a genuine smile. Sandra, welcome. And who is this with you? This is Maria Diaz, Sandra replied. She's a first-generation college student who benefited from one of our after-school programs. She's interested in nonprofit management, so I invited her to observe today. Victoria extended her hand to Maria. Ms. Diaz, we're honored to have you. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the meeting. Your perspective would be invaluable. As the meeting progressed, those familiar with the old Victoria noted a subtle but significant change in her approach. She solicited input from everyone around the table, regardless of their status. She listened more than she spoke. And when Maria offered a hesitant suggestion about outreach to immigrant communities, Victoria asked thoughtful follow-up questions, rather than dismissing the idea. After the meeting, as board members gathered their materials, Sandra approached Victoria. That was a productive session, Sandra commented. I particularly liked how you incorporated Maria's insights. Victoria nodded. She has a unique perspective that most of us around this table have never experienced. It would be foolish to ignore it simply because she's new to these circles. Sandra studied her for a moment. You know, transformation is rare. Most people, when confronted with their biases, become defensive rather than reflective. I had good teachers, Victoria replied simply. As they walked out together, they passed a wall of donor photographs. A recent edition showed Keanu Reeves presenting a check to the foundation, the result of a fundraiser he had organized after the gala. He never mentioned our conversation to you, did he? Victoria asked, nodding toward the photograph. Sandra smiled. Keanu? No, that's not his style. Why do you ask? Because he said something that night that I haven't been able to forget, Victoria admitted. He asked whether I would approach the next unfamiliar face with curiosity or judgment. It was such a simple question, but it changed the way I see these events, and perhaps the way I see myself. That sounds like him, Sandra replied. He has a gift for cutting through pretense. As they reached the elevator, Victoria hesitated. I've been meaning to ask, that black dress you wore to the gala, was it really from a department store? Sandra laughed. Zara, actually. $89 on sale. It was perfect, Victoria said honestly. I spent thousands on my gown, and no one remembers it. But everyone remembers your speech. It's never about what we wear, Sandra replied as the elevator doors opened. It's about what we do. As they descended to the lobby, each woman reflecting on how a single evening had altered their paths. Across town, Keanu Reeves was sitting in a children's hospital, reading to a group of patients. No cameras, no publicity, just the quiet work of making the world a little better, one small act of kindness at a time.